The assembly hall stretched wide enough to hold representatives from 100 worlds. Marble columns rose toward a ceiling that showed the stars themselves, a reminder to all who gathered here that they shared one galaxy, one fragile piece. Today, that piece was being questioned. Ambassador has stood at the speaker's podium, his 4 arms gesturing with practiced elegance. He was young for a Vex, barely 2 centuries old, and his purple skin still held the bright sheen of youth. His voice carried across the chamber with confidence. Honored members of the Galactic Assembly, I stand before you to propose what many have thought but few have dared to say. The ceasefire is obsolete. It has been 3,000 years since humanity last made contact with any species in this chamber. 3,000 years of silence. 3,000 years of restricting our expansion, our trade routes, our very future, all because of a treaty signed in fear by our ancestors. Murmurs rippled through the assembled delegates. Some nodded, others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The younger species especially seemed interested, leaning forward to hear more. Has continued, warming to his subject. I have studied the records, I have read the old treaties, and I have come to believe that we are living in the shadow of exaggeration and myth. Yes, humanity was powerful once. Yes, they ended the War of 1,000 Suns. But the stories we tell about them have grown with each generation. Surely no species could have done what the legends claim. Surely time has made monsters out of what were simply very effective warriors. You know nothing. The voice cut through the chamber like a blade through silk. It came from the eldest section of the assembly, where the Serpentine Coalition kept their seats. Elder Matriarch Hera rose from her coiled position, her scales gleaming silver with age. She was old enough that most couldn't count her years, old enough to have been there. The chamber fell silent. When Hera spoke, even the boldest listened. You were not there, young Haz. You did not see what I saw. You did not watch the stars burn. Her voice was soft but carried perfectly. Let me tell you what really happened. Let me tell you why we fear them. She moved to the center of the chamber, her long body flowing like water over stone. The War of 1,000 Suns was not a metaphor, it was a literal count. 1,000 star systems burning with conflict. The great powers of that age had been fighting for 200 years. The Dominion, the Vex Empire, my own coalition, and a dozen others. We killed billions. We destroyed entire worlds. It was the bloodiest war the galaxy had ever seen. Hera's eyes closed, remembering. And through it all, humanity watched from their borders. They were not small even then. They controlled perhaps 40 systems, had colonies on 100 worlds, but they were neutral. They traded with all sides. They helped refugees. And they warned us again and again to keep the war away from their space. They didn't listen. The way she said it made several delegates flinch. They were winning the war. Their fleet was the largest, their weapons the most advanced. They needed the rare minerals from the asteroid belt in the system. It didn't matter to them that humans had been mining there for 3 generations. It didn't matter that 12 million human civilians lived in those colonies. The commander gave them 1 hour to evacuate. Hera's voice dropped to a whisper. The evacuation ships were still loading children when the bombardment began. They glassed all 3 colonies in an afternoon, turned them to molten slag. They thought it was a tactical necessity, an unfortunate but acceptable cost of war. They were wrong. The matriarch opened her eyes, and several younger delegates gasped at the pain they saw there. I was commanding the coalition's 3rd fleet when we received the first reports. They had gone silent, not fallen, not surrendered, silent. No communications, no signals of any kind. We thought it was a technical error. Then the 2nd world went dark. Then the 3rd. Then the 4th. We didn't understand what was happening until humanity broadcast their message. I remember every word. The Dominion has murdered 12 million human civilians. This act of genocide will not stand. They will cease to exist. This is not a declaration of war. This is a statement of fact. Has tried to interrupt, but surely they defended themselves. They had the largest military in the galaxy. Hera laughed, but it was a terrible sound. They tried, oh how they tried. The Empire had 15,000 warships, 47 colony worlds, a population of 60 billion. They had weapons that could crack planets. They had shields that could withstand the heat of a sun. It took humanity 40 days to erase them from existence. The chamber was so quiet that the sound of breathing seemed loud. I saw it myself. I took my fleet to the Andros system, thinking we might broker a peace. We arrived to find the defense fleet already destroyed, 3,000 warships reduced to debris fields, and the human fleet was there, just 12 vessels, each one sleek and dark as the void between stars. They didn't even acknowledge our presence. They simply began their work. I watched them do something to the planet below. No bombardment, no weapons fire that we could detect, but the atmosphere began to change. Within 6 hours, it was no longer breathable. Within 12, the temperature had risen 40 degrees. Within a day, nothing could survive there. And then they moved to the next world. Hera looked directly at Haz. They went to every world, every station, every ship. They were methodical, efficient, merciless. When fleets tried to fight, they were destroyed so quickly that we barely registered the battles. When leaders tried to surrender, humanity didn't respond. They simply continued their work. On the 40th day, they broadcast again. The Dominion no longer exists. Their worlds are empty. Their fleets are dust. Their civilization is memory. This is what happens when you murder human children. This is what happens when you ignore our warnings. Old Matriarch's voice grew harder. And then they turned to us, to all the species who had stood by, to all of us who had made that terrible war possible. They broadcast to every world, every ship, every communications device in the galaxy. The ceasefire begins now. For 5,000 years there will be no war between the species of this galaxy. No aggression, no invasion, no genocide. Break this peace and we will do to you what we did to the... We will not negotiate. We will not show mercy. We will simply end you. What choice did we have? We signed, all of us, within hours, the most comprehensive peace treaty in galactic history, written in blood and terror. Hera returned to her seat, suddenly looking very tired. And humanity kept their word. They to their own space, sealed their borders. For 3,000 years they have not emerged, not to trade, not to communicate, not even to explore. They are there behind their borders, silent and waiting. You ask why we maintain the ceasefire. Because we remember. Because some of us were there. Because we know with absolute certainty that if we break it, humanity will emerge again. And this time, they will have had 3,000 years to advance their weapons, to refine their methods, to prepare. She fixed Haz with an ancient stare. You call it myth and exaggeration. I call it history. I call it the only thing that has kept this galaxy from tearing itself apart again. The ceasefire has lasted not because we are peaceful by nature, but because we fear what happens if it ends. The vote was called. Despite Haz's protests, the motion to maintain the ceasefire passed, but the victory was narrow, too narrow. As the assembly dispersed, Hera remained coiled in her seat, watching the younger delegates leave. She saw the doubt in their eyes, the curiosity, the arrogance of those who had never witnessed real terror. She feared they would learn the same lesson they had learned. She feared they would learn it too late. 50 years passed like sand through scales. To the elder species, it was barely a breath. To the younger ones, it was 2 generations. Time enough to forget. Time enough to convince themselves that the old stories were exaggerated. Commander Ra of the Concordat stood before the private council of 6 species, all of them young, all of them ambitious. The meeting room was hidden deep within an asteroid station, far from the prying sensors of the Galactic Assembly. What they were planning was not illegal, exactly, but it certainly violated the spirit of the ceasefire. We've completed the survey of the human border, Ra announced, her crystalline body refracting the light into rainbow patterns. 73 probe missions over the past decade. Not one has detected any ship movement beyond their borders. No communications intercepts. No energy signatures consistent with an active civilization. Their automated defenses destroy or disable any probe that crosses too far, but that's just old programming. One of the other commanders leaned forward. He was Axe, whose thick hide had evolved to withstand radiation. What about their colonies, the ones inside their borders? Silent, all of them. We've detected some power generation on a few worlds, but it's minimal. Could be automated systems. Could be a drastically reduced population. Ra brought up a holographic display showing the human border region. It's been 3,000 years. Maybe they evolved into something post-physical. Maybe they retreated into virtual reality. Maybe they simply died out and we're all terrified of automated defense systems and empty worlds. They had been the most vocal advocates for what they called the Coalition of Progress. 6 species, all of them expansion opportunities because of the ancient borders the ceasefire had frozen in place. 6 species who looked at the vast human territory and saw waste, empty worlds that could be colonized, resources that could be harvested, all of it sitting unused because of a treaty signed in another age. The elder species will never agree, Axe said. We've tried the official route. They vote down every proposal to even survey the human borders properly. They're paralyzed by old fears. Then we don't ask permission, Ra replied. She had thought about this for years. The plan was simple. We send an expedition, not an invasion, not an attack. Just a small fleet to one of the old human mining colonies right at the border. We study it. We try to make contact. If humanity responds, we apologize and retreat immediately. If they don't respond, we prove that the threat is gone. And if the elders are right, this came from El, a cautious whose species had joined the coalition reluctantly. If humanity is still there and still dangerous. Ra had anticipated this. Then we learn something crucial. We learn whether they're still capable of enforcing the ceasefire. Either way, we gain information. Right now, we're trapped by uncertainty. This gives us certainty. The debate lasted 3 hours. In the end, 5 species voted yes. El abstained but didn't oppose. The Coalition of Progress was committed. It took another year to assemble the fleet in secret. 200 ships, carefully gathered from volunteer crews and private military contractors. Not enough to fight a war, but enough to look serious. Enough to matter. The target was New Hebron, one of the first human mining colonies, now abandoned for 3. It sat just inside the human border, around a red dwarf star that held little strategic value. The perfect place for a quiet test. Matriarch Hera learned about the plan 3 days before the fleet departed. She called an emergency session of the Galactic Assembly, but it was too late. The coalition had timed it perfectly. By the time the debate could begin, the fleet would already be in human space. She sent one final message to Ra personally, using old channels from when the Serpentine Coalition and the Concordat had been allies. I beg you to reconsider. You are playing with forces beyond your understanding. The humans did not bluff. They do not exaggerate. Turn back before it's too late. Ra read the message aboard her flagship as they approached the jump point to New Hebron. She felt a moment of doubt, seeing the desperate tone in the old matriarch's words, but she was committed now. They all were. The matriarch means well, she told her crew. But she lived through trauma, and trauma makes you see monsters everywhere. We're going to prove that the monster is gone. The fleet jumped. New Hebron appeared on their sensors exactly as the probes had shown. A small rocky world, 3 moons, extensive asteroid mining operations left to drift in orbit, and complete silence. No challenges, no warnings, no signs of life at all. They waited in orbit for 6 hours, broadcasting friendly greetings on all frequencies. Nothing responded. Ra made the decision to land. The colony itself was surprisingly intact. 3,000 years, and the structures still stood, protected by the dry atmosphere and lack of weather. It was eerie walking through streets where humans had once lived. The buildings were sized for them, shorter doorways and narrower halls than most species used. Some structures still had power, drawing from deep geothermal sources that would last for millions of years. Research teams spread out through the colony. They found homes with furniture still in place, warehouses with mining equipment preserved in the dry air, a central plaza with a fountain long since drained, and everywhere the sense that people had simply left one day and never returned. On the fourth day, Doctor made the discovery that would doom them all. She was fascinated by abandoned civilizations. She'd been exploring what looked like an administrative building when she found a computer terminal that still had power. Unlike the others they'd found, this one activated when she touched it. The screen flickered to life, displaying text in clear galactic standard. But the message cycled through every known language, one after another, making sure anyone who found it would understand. Ceasefire protocol active. Agreed duration 5,000 years. Elapsed time 3,153 years. Days remaining 1,847 years. Status monitoring. Stared at the screen, her mandibles clicking nervously. Ra, you need to see this. The commander arrived within minutes. She read the message, felt her crystalline heart begin to pulse faster. It's just an old system, automated monitoring. Then the text changed. Violation detected. Foreign military presence in protected territory. Nature, armed fleet 200 vessels. Location, New Hebron colony. Calculating appropriate response. Ra grabbed her communicator. All ships, immediate evacuation. Get everyone back to the fleet now. The text continued updating. Response calculated. Executing ceasefire enforcement protocol. Stand by. The sky turned white. Not bright, not burning, just white, as if reality itself had been replaced with a blank canvas. Had time to look up through the window, time to see the color drain from everything, time to realize that this was how she would die. Then she was simply gone. All of them were. The 200 ships, the 5,000 crew members, the colony itself. Everything within 1,000 kilometers of New Hebron's surface ceased to exist in any meaningful way. No explosion, no debris field, just an expanding sphere of exotic radiation that sensors couldn't properly classify because it didn't match any known type of energy. At the human border, automated systems that had waited patiently for 3,000 years came online. They had a message to deliver. All across the galaxy, every communications device activated simultaneously. Every screen, every holographic projector, every audio system. The voice that spoke was human, the first human voice anyone had heard in 3. It was calm, measured, and absolutely without mercy. The ceasefire has been violated. At 1437 Galactic Standard Time, the Concordat dispatched a military fleet into protected human territory. This action constitutes a breach of the treaty signed 3,053 years ago. Per the terms of that treaty, all parties responsible will be held accountable. The voice paused, letting that sink in across 100 worlds. The Concordat has been marked for extinction. Any species providing aid, harbor, or interference will share their fate. All galactic species have 72 hours to withdraw all assets from Concordat space. After that period, anyone remaining in territory will be considered hostile. The debt will be paid. The ceasefire will be reinstated. This is your only warning. The transmission ended. In the sudden silence that followed, the galaxy began to realize what was about to happen. The coalition of progress collapsed within hours. 4 species immediately disavowed any involvement, broadcasting desperate messages claiming they had opposed the plan, had tried to stop it, had never really been part of the coalition at all. They began moving their ships and citizens away from space as fast as their engines could carry them. The Galactic Assembly convened in emergency session. The chamber that had once held calm debates now erupted in panic. Representatives screamed at each other. Some tried to flee. Others demanded action, though no one could say what action would help. Matriarch Hera remained coiled in her seat, saying nothing. There was nothing to say. She had warned them. They hadn't listened. Now they would learn. The Concordat government broadcast surrender within the first hour. They claimed it had been rogue elements. They offered reparations. They begged for mercy. They broadcasted their surrender on every frequency, in every language, with increasing desperation. No one responded. The human border remained silent. 72 hours passed. In that time, the greatest evacuation in galactic history took place. Every species with assets in space pulled them out. Millions of workers and traders and diplomats fled in whatever ships they could find. They themselves tried to evacuate their own worlds, but where could they go? No species would take them, terrified of being seen as harboring the condemned. Most of the galaxy was watching when the human fleet emerged from their borders. Long-range sensors picked them up immediately. 12 ships. Just 12, sleek and dark, their hulls seeming to absorb light rather than reflect it. They moved with impossible grace, accelerating without visible engines, changing direction without the brutal force that conventional drives required. 3,000 years. 3,000 years of advancement in isolation. Whatever technology these ships used, it was beyond anything the current galaxy possessed. The military made the decision to fight. It was suicide, but it was better than waiting helplessly for extinction. They gathered their defense fleet, 8,000 ships strong, and positioned them between the human vessels and the largest military force assembled since the War of 1,000 Suns, all focused on stopping 12 ships. The battle lasted 11 minutes. The galaxy watched through long-range sensors, through probe cameras, through the live feeds that spread across 1,000 worlds. They watched the fleet open fire with everything they had: missiles that could destroy continents, energy weapons that could melt starship hulls in seconds, kinetic rounds moving at relativistic speeds. The combined firepower was enough to shatter a planet. The human ships didn't dodge. They didn't activate shields. The weapons simply stopped existing when they got close. Missiles vanished. Energy beams dissipated. Kinetic rounds turned to dust. And then the human ships began their own attack. What they did wasn't recognizable as weapons fire. The ships began to come apart at the molecular level, their hulls separating into component atoms that drifted away in glittering clouds. Ships that had survived decades of combat simply dissolved like sugar in water. 8,000 vessels became 8,000 atomic clouds in the span of minutes. Then the human fleet moved to the... They didn't bombard it, they didn't glass it, they did something worse. The 12 ships positioned themselves in high orbit and began to emit a field that sensors could barely detect. Within an hour, the planet's atmosphere began to change. Oxygen levels dropped. Carbon dioxide rose. The temperature began to increase, slowly at first, then faster. The government broadcast one final message: "Please, we surrender, we were wrong, please stop." The human ships continued their work without acknowledgement, methodical, patient, thorough. The gamma wave broadcast went out to all worlds simultaneously. It was in a human voice, the same calm voice from before. You are being given a choice. Evacuate to the designated refugee worlds where you will live under galactic protection, or remain on your and perish. You have 48 hours to decide. Most fled. Billions of packed into whatever ships they could find, heading for the refugee worlds that had been hastily designated by the Galactic Assembly. Other species, horrified by what they were witnessing, provided ships and supplies for the evacuation. It was the least they could do. But some refused to leave. Pride, defiance, or simply the inability to abandon their ancestral homes. They stayed on their worlds, broadcasting messages of resistance, claiming they would fight to the last. The human ships arrived at each world in turn. 47 colonies, 47 times they performed their careful work. The atmospheres changed. The temperatures rose. The worlds became uninhabitable, but the cities remained standing. The structures stayed intact, monuments to what had been. On the 73rd day, it was over. The Concordat, a civilization of 60 billion reduced to scattered millions living on charity worlds, their fleets destroyed, their worlds emptied, their civilization ended. And then humanity broadcast one final time. Debt paid, the ceasefire is reinstated. Remaining time, 1,847 years. We will not emerge again until the term expires or the ceasefire is violated once more. This galaxy has been given peace. The price of breaking it is now understood. The human fleet returned to their borders. The 12 ships disappeared beyond the edge of sensors. The borders sealed. Silence returned. In the Galactic Assembly, the emergency session finally came to order. Representatives sat in stunned shock, still processing what they had witnessed. The chamber was different now. The arrogance was gone. The doubt was gone. In its place was the crystalline clarity of terror. Matriarch Hera addressed the chamber. Her voice was tired but firm. Now you understand. Now you see what I tried to tell you. The ceasefire was never about human mercy. It was never about them wanting peace for its own sake. It was about them giving us an alternative to annihilation. She gestured to the empty seats where the delegation had once sat. They don't want our worlds. They don't want our resources. They don't want to rule or conquer or expand. They want to be left alone. That is all they have ever wanted. And the price of disturbing them is everything you have, everything you are, everything your species will ever be. The vote was called. The motion to uphold the ceasefire for the remaining 1,847 years. This time there was no debate, no discussion. The vote was unanimous. Even the abstract had fled. In the following weeks, monuments began appearing across the galaxy. Stone pillars, metal sculptures, holographic markers. They appeared on 1,000 worlds in 100 languages, all carrying the same message. Here stands the reminder. Peace is preferable to the alternative. The ceasefire remains. 1,847 years. Do not forget what happens when it breaks. The survivors settled into their refugee worlds. They would live, but they would never forget. Their children would grow up learning the story of how their civilization ended because they didn't believe the warnings, how they tested humanity's resolve and found it absolute. The galaxy entered a new age of the ceasefire. This one enforced not by fading memory or ancient fear, but by fresh terror, by the knowledge that somewhere beyond those sealed borders, humanity continued its evolution in isolation. Advanced technology that made their ships seem like magic, weapons that could dismantle matter itself. And the patience to wait out the remaining centuries, counting down the days until the ceasefire expired, and they would have to decide whether to rejoin the galactic community or remain forever apart. But that was a problem for another age. For now, the galaxy had peace. It had the peace that humanity had imposed, the peace that came from understanding exactly what would happen if it was broken. In her chambers, Matriarch Hera looked at the countdown clock she had installed. 1,847 years remaining. She would not live to see the end of it. None of her generation would. But she made one final recording to be passed down to her successors, to be opened when the ceasefire timer reached its final days. To whoever watches this, I was there when humanity emerged. I watched them erase I watched them end I have seen what they are capable of when disturbed. If you are watching this, the ceasefire is ending. When it does, humanity will emerge again, and you will have to make first contact with a species that has been isolated for 5,000 years. Be careful, be respectful, be honest, because if you make them angry again, there will be nothing left of us to build monuments. The recording ended. The timer continued its countdown, and humanity remained silent beyond their borders waiting.